To draw anything in perspective like a pro, you only need two ingredients: the ability to rotate these three forms and arranging them convincingly in a 3D space. In this video, we'll be looking into pro mangaka Omao's work to learn the dirty secrets behind constructing dynamic shots like these. These will be broken down into 7 progression levels, and I'll also be sharing some practice drills that will help you master perspective along the way. The humble cube. This is pretty self-explanatory. If you're a beginner, this thing is going to be a best friend for a while, so get used to drawing it. When we look at Omao's work, you'll quickly notice that 95% of these scenes are constructed by some form of cube or cuboids. To draw anything in 3D effectively, we'll need to understand that there is an X, Y, and Z axis, which is perfectly represented by the cube. Once you get used to drawing random floating cubes like these, we can move on and make things a little harder. Oh, by the way, all the resources I'll use in this video will be linked down in the description below, including some of the 3D stuff I'll get to later. Okay, but how do we unify them into the same space though? Well, this is a good exercise to start learning this. We're still stuck with cubes, but with this exercise, we're going to rotate the cubes in slightly different angles, which is more intentional and requires a little more brain power. Each cube here has to look rotated by just the right amount with each iteration. I would suggest making your cubes see-through like this to make sure they're not wonky. This is useful for drawing things that are grouped in an environment like this. If we look at Omao's work again, we see very similar arrangements of cuboids across the space. But it's also an entry point into drawing stacked forms like the human body in perspective, which we'll discuss later in the video. I'll be honest, it's not that complicated, you just need to grind it out. For example, the left side and the right side here is pretty much the same thing. I saw some people drawing cats or Miku heads inside the box, so you know, if it's too tedious or easy, make it fun. In drawings like these, we're basically just filling in this big cube, aka the room, with a bunch of smaller cubes. We see this a lot, especially in man-made environments. This next exercise quickly became one of my favorites because it really forced me to think through the space whenever I add in something new. You know, where is the cube placed? Which cube here is in the front? How far apart are they? Things like that. I got so much more out of this exercise once I slowed down to consciously think through these little details. It helped me understand how to keep things grounded, which is going to help in placing characters and objects in environments later on. In drawings like these, we can get by with using a perspective grid. But the problem with relying on a single grid too much is exactly this. Similarly to when you rotate the cubes in the previous exercise, you're essentially creating a new set of horizon lines and vanishing points. This is actually closer to reality because nothing follows only a single grid. Another problem you'll eventually run into is with characters. You will need me to tell you at this point that characters will never follow a grid like this. And this was my biggest bottleneck when I was learning how to add organic characters into backgrounds like this. So we want to train ourselves to be able to intuitively rotate things within the same space. Only then our drawings will look much more organic and realistic. That's why doing exercises like these will help you so much more instead of just relying on grids all the time. But at this point, you might be wondering, how am I supposed to go from this to this? And that's exactly what we're going to talk about next. We want to apply our perspective skills to more complex forms like the human body so we can finally draw our favorite waifus in various angles, right? But anatomy is hard. They twist and turn. What the heck? There are a lot of weird scientific names and just a huge pain in general to learn from scratch. If only there's someone simplifying them down and giving easy to follow step-by-step guidance somewhere. And that's what today's sponsor Skillshare does best. Skillshare is the largest online learning community that houses thousands of classes on not only all the technical art skills, but also other art-related content like graphic design, video production, and entrepreneurship. All very useful skills to learn if you want to become a well-rounded artist. This summer, I want to make the most out of my free time to learn as much as possible about art. Wing Canvas, who happen to have a YouTube channel as well, have a whole set of classes on figure drawing and anatomy. A lot of the concepts they use in the classes are similar to what we've discussed in this video, so you'll see a direct application of the perspective skills you learned in this video onto anatomy. I also really like this figure drawing class from Robert Mazzullo. It helped a ton with the basics of posing and gesture, so highly recommend you guys to check them out. The first 500 people to use my link in the description below to join Skillshare will receive a 1-month free trial. That's 30 days of free knowledge. Thank you Skillshare for sponsoring the video. We've only done stuff related to cubes so far, and I think they're great for building foundation for environments. But if you want to get to the level where you can comfortably draw organic forms like the human figure at any angle, we have to start understanding the other two shapes that I mentioned at the beginning. If we look at Omao's work again, you will notice the second most common form here are cylinders. And really, that's all we need to construct any basic scene or figure in perspective. Look at this drawing here. It might look really complicated with all the little parts going on in the background, but really they're all just cubes and cylinders. Another great example is figures. Once you learn how cylinders work, the human figure becomes more approachable because again, look, they're just everywhere. I drew a form that's relatively close to a cube with a rounded edge like this just to get used to the curves in a cylinder. It's sort of like an in-between step here. And I did some cylinders in rotating angles as well, similar to the ones I did in level 2. For some reason, I don't feel they're as hard as drawing cubes, even though this is supposed to be a higher level exercise. The only part you need to pay attention here is figuring out the relationship between these two circles, and you just connect them with straight lines like this. Now in this level, we're finally transitioning into human figures, considering the main focal point of most drawings are characters. Using the same format as a level 2 exercise, we will rotate this form that kind of looks like the human torso and the Loomis head slightly each time to be able to visualize the full 3D shape of it. Because we're not dealing with cubes or any extremely simplified form anymore, this exercise actually challenges our sense of proportion and our ability to recognize landmarks, which is extremely important for drawing human figures in perspective. To be able to clear this exercise comfortably, I'll have to be able to make sure that my form stays symmetrical and structurally sound. All the skills I learned from level 1 to 4 are helping me out here. See how this torso form is basically a weird rounded cube with a taper plus a cylinder at the bottom. The biggest challenge for me was to figure out how this taper behaves when the angle changes and how to keep it consistent across all the drawings I do here. For the Loomis head, it's easier to start with the sphere first and then construct the form using the guidelines you see here. If you actually draw the Loomis head properly, you measure out the proportions as well, but here I'm just winging it. There are many other body parts you can practice individually like this, so feel free to swap them out as you practice. Okay, I'll be honest, that last exercise was kinda hard. So if you're struggling at any stage of these exercises, just go back to the previous progressions and do them as warm-ups to make sure you really get them down before moving on to the next level. In this level, we're finally going to practice foreshortening, the cool stuff. I'm so excited. With foreshortening, being able to clear level 4 and 5 comfortably becomes much more important. If you think about it, the stuff that most commonly foreshorten in drawings are cylindrical shaped objects like various weapons, limbs, and fingers, right? So in this level, I practice various foreshortened angles using these simplified arms. One trick to doing these well is to imagine the overall form pointing away from the camera. You want a relatively big difference between this face of the cylinder that's closer to the camera and the one further away to really sell the foreshortening effect. Surprisingly, I had a lot of fun in this level. I'm really happy with how these turned out. And the final step here would be fisheye or curvilinear perspective. I know that technically this isn't that difficult to achieve.
All you have to do is follow the grid.
Right? Technically, yes, but the most useful thing I learned about curvilinear perspective is not that it now has 5 vanishing points instead of 3, but actually the closer the objects are placed at the edges of the grid, the more extreme the distortion gets. I think that's really all you need to know about fisheye. Having some sort of foreshortened object in a fisheye scene will also help sell the dramatic effect more. I applied everything I learned from the previous levels onto this piece here. I'll be honest, I'm not quite on this level yet, so it took a bit of trial and error to get it to look convincing. As I mentioned before, every time you rotate something, the grid and the vanishing points changes. Our ultimate goal here is to be able to comfortably rotate things around within the same space. Even just a small part of the drawing like what Omao is doing here helps a lot in making the scene look more natural. Also, as I become more comfortable with perspective, I realized that I'll eventually hit a point where the drawing will look convincing enough and organic at the same time. Once the perspective is done to a, let's say, 80% accuracy. It's comforting to know that it adds a little character and style as well when the perspective is not grid perfect. Let me know in the comments which level you're currently practicing. I'm curious to know. In the meantime, I'm sure you'll like this video as well, so click it.
Subscribe!
Robert Marzullo. Bye!